My name is Mark Ellis, and at 51, I have learned that a man can survive the sharpest blows life gives him, but it is the soft wounds, the ones that arrive quietly, almost politely, that cut the deepest. The night I hosted what I hoped would be a family celebration was not violent or dramatic. It didn't shatter anything. It simply revealed what had already been broken. I arrived at the conference hall in the late afternoon, long before anyone else, long before the caterers wheeled in their silver trays or the jazz trio slipped through the side entrance with their soft laughter and carefully handled instruments. The room, still untouched, stretched wide and empty, washed in the warm amber light from the chandeliers I had insisted on installing when we renovated last year. I always told myself that warm lights made people feel welcome, though I suppose I never considered that welcome is a two-way exchange. I set the white linens myself, pressed and folded, smoothed out until not a wrinkle dared to rise. I laid the tall candles at the center of each table, aligning them with the precision of a man who has built his life on order. The place cards, printed with neatly spaced letters, formed a circle of names that belonged to people I had spent decades loving, supporting, financing, forgiving. My children's names looked strangely formal on crisp cardstock, as though the distance between us had seeped into the ink. When the caterers arrived, the room filled briefly with motion and sound, the soft rustle of uniforms, the muted ring of silverware placed against porcelain, the rich aroma of warm dishes prepared with care and paid for weeks in advance. 16 entrees, 16 seats, 16 silent prayers that perhaps tonight would feel different from the years that had preceded it. I imagined the moment they would walk in, my two children arriving together, my son's easy half-smile softening the tension that always lived behind his eyes, my daughter glancing around to assess whether everything measured up to the standards she never voiced aloud. I imagined polite greetings, maybe even the tentative warmth of reconnection. I told myself not to expect too much, but even scaled-down hopes have weight. By 7 o'clock, the candles glowed steadily, the food was ready, and the musicians stood waiting for a signal. I checked my phone. No message, no delay, no reassurance that they were on their way. The caterers looked at me with the professional neutrality of people trained not to intrude on private disappointments. At 7:15, one of the waiters approached gently, hands folded in front of him. "Would you like us to keep the dishes warm a little longer, sir?" I nodded, offering a small smile, the kind that tries to hide the first ripple of doubt. 7:30 arrived, and the trio adjusted their sheet music, glancing at the door from time to time as if the guests might slip in any moment. I sat alone at the far end of the long table, the candles flickering in front of untouched glasses and empty chairs that stared back at me like hollow echoes of a family that once showed up without being asked. By 8 o'clock, the room no longer felt expectant. It felt suspended, frozen in a moment where everyone but me already knew the truth. I checked my phone again, slower this time, aware of the pattern. The hall's quiet began pressing inward, settling around the tablecloth folds and reflecting off polished surfaces like a soft, mocking light. The waiters approached once more, this time with the kind of caution reserved for news that might bruise. "Sir, shall we begin clearing the dishes?" Their voices were gentle, but the question hollowed something inside me. No one was coming. Not late, not delayed, not lost in traffic. They had simply chosen not to be there. By 9, the musicians packed their instruments quietly, avoiding eye contact out of courtesy. They had not played a single note. The plates were cold. 16 seats remained unclaimed, as if the evening had been designed not for celebration but for revelation. The room looked magnificent. Every detail perfect, every surface arranged with care, and that perfection only deepened the ache. It was a banquet without guests, a reunion without family, a silent inventory of all the years I had held out hope that effort could repair something that had long since drifted beyond reach. I stood for a long moment in the center of the hall, staring at the circle of empty chairs. The candles, now burning lower, cast elongated shadows that stretched across the floor like a quiet procession. The air felt colder, as though the absence of my children had seeped into the walls themselves. I tried to swallow the humiliation, but humiliation has a way of settling into the bones. too soft to break you, too steady to ignore. When I finally walked out, I did not blow out the candles. I left them burning on purpose, letting the staff handle what remained. I didn't trust my hands to stay steady enough to extinguish them. Outside, the night air was warm, carrying the scent of late spring, a stark contrast to the chilled room behind me. I paused in the parking lot, looking up at the windows of my own building, the building I had built, expanded, financed, and protected. Tonight, it had witnessed something I could never have admitted aloud. Betrayal does not always announce itself. It does not always shout or shatter or wound violently. Sometimes it arrives dressed in silence, walks past 16 untouched plates, and sits quietly in the chair where a loved one should have been. The morning after the failed banquet arrived with the kind of soft gray light that makes a city feel distant from itself. Charlotte's skyline, usually sharp and assertive against the horizon, blurred slightly through the haze. I watched it from my kitchen window, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I didn't really taste. The night before had left a residue, thin, invisible, but unmistakably present, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire that should never have happened. For a few minutes, I tried to do what I had always done: rationalize. I told myself there were reasonable explanations: confusion with dates, unexpected delays, emergencies they were too flustered to communicate. A softer part of me, the part still trained by years of hope, whispered that maybe they had planned a surprise or mixed up the time or assumed it was casual enough to arrive late. But the older, quieter part, the one that had lived through years of missed holidays, knew better. It wasn't just last night. It had never been just one night. Still, habits formed over decades don't dissolve in a single morning. So I scrolled through old messages, looking not for evidence but for reassurance. Instead, I found something more unsettling: consistency. A line of forgotten birthdays, postponed dinners, skipped anniversaries, and half-hearted apologies that all began to look identical when placed side by side. There were photos of past celebrations where the table held more candles than people. Memories of corporate dinners where I stood by the entrance long after the last car had left, waiting for children who arrived only when dessert plates were being cleared. Quiet nights where Emily, my late wife, had quietly adjusted place settings to make the room feel less empty, as if symmetry could ease the sting of absence. She had always handled disappointment with grace. I remember her lighting candles on my birthday even when she knew the kids wouldn't arrive until the cake had gone cold. She'd leave a slice of dessert untouched on the counter, saying it was just in case they stopped by. She taught me the art of waiting, the art of forgiving, and the art of believing the next year or the next dinner or the next holiday might be different. But patterns have a way of resurfacing no matter how much optimism you drape over them. The more I replayed the memories, the more I realized how often I had been alone in moments meant for family. Dinners where 2 plates remained untouched until I finally wrapped them in foil. Weekends I spent calling the children, only to hear a tone of distraction in their voices, that subtle distance of people who feel obligated but not truly present. Even holidays, once vivid and full, had slowly become rituals of solitary effort. Cooking, setting a table for too many, leaving the television on low just to soften the silence. For years, I had built reasons around these moments. They were busy, overwhelmed, tired, swamped with obligations, navigating adult lives I wanted to respect. I disguised every wound with understanding, the way a craftsman might apply varnish to cover a crack. But some cracks aren't meant to be covered. Some are meant to warn you the foundation has shifted. That banquet, the one I crafted with my own hands, the one that felt like an offering, was not an exception. It was a magnifying glass. And through it, I finally saw the shape of something I had been refusing to examine. I had been living according to a script that was never rewritten, only repeated. I prepared. I waited. I forgave. I convinced myself that disappointment was temporary, when in truth it had been the architecture of our interactions for years. As the morning unfolded, the house felt strangely lighter, as if naming the pattern had loosened a weight I didn't know I was carrying. I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, watching steam rise from my cup, realizing that last night's humiliation didn't break me. It clarified me. There is a difference between being left out once and being left out repeatedly. One is an oversight, the other is a message. The more I replayed the years, the more obvious that message became. I had shown up to everything. Recitals, graduations, job interviews, crises, milestones. I had been present even when it cost me time, money, and rest I could barely afford. But somewhere along the way, presence had stopped being reciprocal. Their absence had become a tradition I quietly absorbed into my home, my holidays, my expectations. Emily had tried to warn me, I think, in her own gentle way. She once told me that love requires presence, and presence requires intention. Back then, I interpreted it through the soft lens of her compassion. Forgiving, understanding, hoping. But now, years after she was gone, her words echoed differently. Presence is a choice, and so is absence. By midday, I stopped checking my phone. There were no missed calls, no explanations, no apologies. The silence sat cleanly, neatly, as if it had been placed there with purpose. I didn't feel anger. Anger burns too quickly for this kind of truth. What I felt was steadier, heavier, something closer to acceptance. Not defeat, but recognition. This wasn't a sudden collapse of my family bonds. It was simply the clearest version of a story that had been unfolding quietly for years. And perhaps the greatest tragedy was not the absence itself, but the way I had taught myself to ignore it. That morning, I understood something I had been unable or unwilling to see. You cannot fix what the other person does not see as broken. The banquet was not ruined by their absence. The banquet revealed a truth I had hidden from myself. The night staff was nearly finished clearing the remains of what had never truly begun when I finally returned to my office. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I preferred the way the city glow seeped through the blinds, casting thin horizontal shadows across the floor. Gentle reminders that the world carried on even when something inside me had stopped moving. Silence followed me in, taking its place beside the exhaustion that had settled in my chest. I told myself I only needed a moment to breathe, to steady my thoughts before heading home. But my hand drifted toward the drawer where I kept company receipts, invoices, and all the financial markers that helped me maintain a sense of control over a business life that had always run smoother than my personal one. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, at least not consciously. But that's the thing about clarity. Once it arrives, it doesn't stay confined. It spreads. It illuminates things you didn't intend to examine. I opened my banking app the way a tired man checks the weather, quietly, without expectation. The familiar rows of transactions slid into view, steady and predictable. Or so I believed. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Routine payments, supplier invoices, a charitable donation I'd forgotten I'd approved. But as I scrolled, the numbers took on a different tone. Something tight and uncomfortable began forming at the edge of my awareness. A catering withdrawal. Obvious. Expected. A charge for boutique wine. Premium. Imported. Well beyond what I normally stocked for the office. Designer clothing. Event services. Photography deposits. A delivery from a luxury bakery I had never heard of. Small pieces taken alone. But placed together, they formed a pattern impossible to dismiss. The timestamps told their own quiet story. These expenses had begun weeks earlier, threaded through the same period when my children had been growing more distant, more dismissive, more selective in their presence. Each purchase had been meticulously authorized through my account. Someone had used photos of my business card to approve them. Someone had assumed I wouldn't look too closely or wouldn't ask too many questions. Generosity, I realized, can blind a man if he lets it. I had always been willing to share what I earned, especially with the people I hoped to draw closer. But there's a difference between generosity and exploitation, the same way there's a difference between absence and indifference. One wounds, the other corrodes. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen, my thumb hanging over the glass. The violation wasn't just financial, it was deliberate, coordinated. A quiet taking that aligned too neatly with their steady emotional withdrawal. It wasn't the first time they had taken advantage of my willingness to give, but it was the first time the evidence sat so plainly in front of me, stripped of excuses or sentiment. The room seemed to grow colder as the revelation settled. I felt the kind of stillness that comes not from shock, but from recognition. A slow, dawning understanding that the night I had spent alone in that grand, empty hall had not been the only humiliation. It had simply been the most visible one. I set my phone down, trying to steady the tremor that had begun in my hand. Maybe I could have stopped there and gone home, but clarity rarely lets a man leave the truth half-seen. I opened social media not because I expected comfort, but because I needed context. What I found reshaped everything. They were celebrating. Not in a restaurant. Not casually. Not delayed. They were across town. At a home I didn't recognize. Large, modern, expensive, filled with soft lighting and handcrafted decor. The photos were posted only minutes earlier. My children stood among unfamiliar guests, dressed elegantly, glasses raised, laughter frozen in place by a phone camera that captured more truth than any explanation they might eventually offer. They were not running late. They were not confused by the time. They were not planning to arrive at all. Their clothes, their surroundings, their expressions. Everything in the photos told me my event had never been on their schedule. They had built an entirely separate evening. One that required my resources but not my presence. In one picture, I recognized a dessert from the bakery that had appeared on my business statement. In another, a wine label from the boutique charge I had questioned moments earlier. The betrayal did not feel sharp. It felt precise, an incision made with a practiced hand. And in an unexpected way, it brought a strange kind of relief. Because for the first time in years, the truth stood clearly in front of me, without disguise, without softened edges, without the hopeful reinterpretation I had forced upon it. It was almost liberating to see how calculated it all was. There was nothing accidental to misunderstand, nothing emotional to repair, nothing ambiguous to cling to. The dinner I had prepared so carefully was not abandoned. It was replaced. They had chosen celebration, just not with me. Not for me. And certainly not beside me. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that understanding settle into my ribs. The room remained quiet, save for the faint hum of the HVAC system and the distant city lights flickering against the blinds. Oddly, I didn't feel the devastation I might have expected. What I felt instead was clarity. Clean, unfiltered, grounded. A man cannot fix what he refuses to see. And for years I had been blind by choice. But blindness requires a kind of hope that no longer lived in me. What replaced it wasn't bitterness or anger. It was something steadier, something colder, something honest. The violation had not broken me. It had freed me from pretense, from expectation, from the quiet burden of waiting for people who had long since stopped waiting for me. And in that freedom, I began to understand that this night, this hollow event in the glow of a beautifully prepared but entirely empty hall, would be the turning point I had unknowingly needed. The moment where I finally saw my life without the fog of hope. The moment where truth stepped forward and stood without apology. The moment where the man I had been stopped, and the man I needed to become finally arrived. I did not sleep the night I discovered the truth behind the empty banquet hall. I left the office sometime after midnight, but the cold clarity that had settled inside me did not soften when I reached home. It followed me through the doorway, into the dark living room, into the kitchen where I set my keys down with a quiet click. It moved with me like a steady companion. Calm, patient, stripped of emotion. It wasn't anger that kept me awake. Anger would have burned quickly and left nothing but ash. What I felt instead was something far steadier, far more practical. A quiet alignment with a version of myself that had always existed beneath the surface. Measured, observant, unwilling to ignore the architecture of truth once exposed. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself walking through the house, moving without conscious decision. My feet carried me to the hallway closet where Emily had once kept our family files in neat, labeled boxes. After she passed, I moved everything to my office storage, telling myself it was to keep things organized for the business. But in truth, I think I moved them because I couldn't bear to sift through her handwriting or the scent of her perfume that still lingered on the envelopes she sealed with such care. Now, standing in the dim light of my office, I felt no hesitation as I reached for the locked cabinets. Emily had insisted we keep them for protection, she'd said once, with that quiet seriousness she reserved for matters that never made sense to me at the time. I remember smiling at her, assuming she meant protecting the company from outside threats. But Emily was never naive. She understood the world differently, intuitively. She understood that the greatest risks rarely come from strangers. They come from the people who believe they are entitled to the things you built. I turned on the small desk lamp, just enough light to cast a soft glow across the wooden surface, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. I inserted the old brass key and felt the mechanism shift with a reluctant click. The cabinet door opened, revealing rows of neatly organized binders and envelopes, each labeled in Emily's steady handwriting. Ownership documents, trust agreements, financial audits, original firm contracts, building deeds, protection clauses written so simply and elegantly that even exhaustion couldn't obscure their meaning. I pulled out file after file, laying them on the desk like a forensic reconstruction of my life. I read through pages slowly, not searching for a surprise, but for understanding. One document led to another, and then to another, forming a chain of legal structures Emily had built long before her decline, long before she lost the strength to speak more than a sentence without pain. She had prepared not just our home, not just our estate, but our entire business infrastructure, quietly, thoroughly, with a level of foresight I had never credited properly while she was alive. In her absence, her intentions became painfully clear. The conference hall, my hall, belonged solely to me, not shared, not vulnerable to claims, not subject to anyone's expectations or attachments. It had been placed in a private trust under a structure that Noah and Claire, my children, could not access, borrow against, or dismantle. Emily had insulated me long before I knew I needed insulating. Every clause bore her imprint, her calm intelligence, her protective instinct that always seemed to stretch just a little farther than my own. I wondered briefly whether she had seen something years before I did, whether she had sensed the slow drift of our children's priorities, the subtle entitlement that had crept into their choices, the quiet assumption that my sacrifices were infinite and my presence optional. Standing alone in the dim room, surrounded by documents she had left behind, I realized she had known more than she ever shared. Her preparedness was not rooted in paranoia. It was rooted in love, the kind of love that looks beyond sentiment and into the structure of a future she feared I would face alone. As dawn neared, a muted blue light seeped through the blinds, softening the room's edges. I remained seated at the desk, reviewing each page until the city outside began to stir. It felt like reading a guidebook written by someone who foresaw the exact shape of my present. A blueprint not only of legal protection but of emotional clarity. By sunrise, I closed the final folder and sat back in my chair. I felt no rage, no grief, no need for confrontation. In the quiet hours of the night, something far more profound had settled in me. My children believed they had taken advantage of a moment, a dinner, a man who would always keep waiting for them no matter how far they wandered. They believed the abandoned banquet was a private humiliation. But they did not know the truth. They had not humiliated me. They had revealed themselves. They had not deprived me. They had freed me from an illusion. They had not taken anything from me. They had reminded me what I still owned. Legally, structurally, unquestionably. The conference hall stood not as a monument to disappointment, but as a testament to Emily's foresight and my own discipline. It belonged to me in ways they had never imagined, wrapped in protections they had never bothered to understand. And for the first time in years, the emptiness I felt was not a wound, it was space. Space where hope had once lived, now cleared for something steadier and stronger. As the morning sun finally brushed the surface of my desk, I closed the cabinet doors and locked them again. This time I understood exactly what I was locking away. Not secrets, not fear, but the final piece of a story I had been blind to for far too long. I was not abandoned. I was liberated. And liberation, even the quiet kind that arrives in a dim office at dawn, has a gravity all its own. In the quiet after dawn, with the documents locked away again and the night's truth settled into something firm inside me, I felt a stillness I had not known in years. Not the stillness of defeat, nor the hollow calm that follows humiliation. This was different. This was a stillness with direction. A stillness with purpose. A stillness that had finally stopped waiting for apologies or explanations that would never come. I made coffee, a habit more than a need, and sat at the kitchen table long enough for the steam to curl into the air and disappear. The sunlight nudged its way across the floorboards, touching the edges of the room gently, the way Emily used to place a hand on my arm when she wanted me to pause. I realized, as I watched the light move, that this was the first morning in years when I did not hold even a faint hope that my children might call. And for the first time, that absence did not sting. They had crossed a line the night before, a line they didn't seem aware existed. There is a particular kind of betrayal that happens not through violence or malice but through indifference. A cool, practiced assumption that your presence is optional while your resources remain perpetually available. What they had done was not a sudden act of cruelty. It was the final note in a long, predictable pattern. One I had finally learned to hear clearly. By 8:30, the decision was already fully formed inside me. Not rushed, not emotional, just inevitable. A natural next step in a story they had been writing for years without knowing I was taking notes. I drove downtown through early traffic, the city shaking off its morning slumber. The office buildings reflected the pale morning sky, the sidewalks filling with people dressed in pressed suits and hurried intentions. I parked in the underground garage of a building I had walked into countless times before. A place where lawyers, architects, and financial advisors moved like quiet machinery through the routines of other people's lives. I moved through the lobby without hurry, nodding politely to the receptionist who recognized me. The elevator hummed as it carried me upward, each floor passing with a soft mechanical sigh. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway I had walked many times with Emily. Together, we had sat across from attorneys discussing trusts, revising contracts, planning safeguards she insisted would matter someday. I used to think she overprepared. Now I understood she had simply seen the future more clearly than I did. The real estate attorney, her attorney, still kept an office at the far end of the hallway. I had not spoken to him in years, but when I entered, he rose from his chair with a quiet recognition that softened the edge of the morning. I handed him the folder with the building documents, the trust agreements, and the relevant clauses Emily had prepared so meticulously. I told him, in calm, measured words, what I wanted to do. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady and professional. And when I finished, he nodded with a kind of respectful certainty that only comes from someone who recognizes when a man has arrived at a decision he will not walk back. Within the hour, papers were drafted. By late morning, signatures were placed. By midday, every key associated with that event hall, every deed, every operational account, every revenue stream, shifted entirely into a trust structure that no one but me could open, alter, or revoke. But that was only the beginning. I had built that hall. I had expanded it. I had poured pieces of my life into it the way some men pour themselves into art or music or quiet collections of rare books. For years, it had served as a backdrop for meetings, celebrations, and the early dreams of a business that once felt like it would pull my family together. But last night had changed that. The hall was no longer a symbol of success or hope. It had become a museum of truth, a place where 16 empty chairs had shown me exactly how little my presence mattered to the people who should have valued it most. So I did what clarity demanded. I sold it, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare or warning. A private buyer had expressed interest in the property months earlier, and the attorney handled the paperwork with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. The sale closed faster than I expected, a clean exchange executed before lunchtime. There was something therapeutic in the finality of it. The hall that had once held my expectations now belonged to someone else. Its future was no longer tied to my name, my memories, or my longing for a family that never truly showed up. In one morning, I severed the last piece of ground where I had been waiting for them. As I walked out of the attorney's office, the weight I carried for years seemed to step aside. Not fully gone, but no longer pressing on the center of my chest. The afternoon sun was brighter than it had been when I entered, catching on the glass of the building and scattering light across the pavement. My children would not know what had happened. Not today, not tomorrow, not until a moment in the future when they assume something was still theirs to claim. They would believe they merely skipped a dinner. They would believe they disappointed me briefly, superficially. But the truth was much quieter, much deeper. They had skipped the final event I would ever host for them. They had forfeited a seat at a table I had held open for too many years. They had chosen absence on the last night their presence could have mattered. And I, in return, chose something they never expected from me. Boundaries made not of emotion, but of law. As I reached my car, I paused before opening the door. The reflection in the driver's side window showed a man older than he felt. Tired but not defeated. Changed but not broken. A man who had finally stepped out of the long shadow of waiting. Humiliation had been temporary. Clarity had been necessary. But the freedom that followed, quiet, steady, absolute, was permanent. And in that freedom I realized something profound. I had spent years trying to earn a place in the hearts of people who had already stepped away. Now, at last, I was ready to build a life where I no longer waited at doors that never opened.